Yeah, welcome to another edition of the M365 FM podcast. Today we are diving into one of the most critical topics in modern IT, identity security. As organizations continue moving workloads to Microsoft 365 and Azure, identities have become the new secret perimeter. Joining me today is Jonathan John Hope, Microsoft MVP, Microsoft 365 solution architect, and specialist in identity and access management. John Alway has spent more than the decade designing and operation large-scale infrastructure environments from enterprise VMware platforms to modern Azure native architectures. His expertise spans conditional access, Azure security, infrastructure as code using Bicep, governance, and security identity at scale. Joe has also written extensively about Azure, often overlooked role in identity protection and cloud security. Yeah, Joe, welcome to the MC65 podcast.
Hey, thank you, Marco. Appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, that was that was quite an intro. Um, yeah. No, I mean a little bit about me. I come from the managed service space where I worked for an MSP provider here in Virginia for about 15 years. Started my way up from the help desk and worked into, modernizing virtual servers. I specifically was a VMware engineer who then moved into the Microsoft side because let's be honest, BPOS was a thing back in the day and everyone wanted to jump on board. And that quickly started to change what I was doing from an identity perspective and understanding Azure Active Directory, now Entra ID. And today, I now work for an organization whose sole focus is basically optimizing that space. So I work for a company called Enforcer. And one of the things that I love about it is it gives me an opportunity to talk about things like these, such as securing identity at scale. So
Mm,
yeah, no, excited to be
Yeah,
here.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, you spent many years in working with VMware before moving into Azure.
Yep,
Um,
yep.
are there any lessons from traditional infrastructure still apply in today's cloud first world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So ironically enough, I did actually just write a blog today around groups and the idea that, you talk about a lot, which is governance and how groups can do that. I think there's a lot of tie-overs, right? I mean, the idea of least privilege still pertains on premise to the cloud. It's just it shifts the structure and how that works, right? So today we have to understand that like not everything on-prem has to correlate to exact, replica in the cloud. So we want to start to separate that from a governance standpoint. And the idea of being able to, really create kind of a secure structure in the cloud, so that lateral movement isn't a thing where it can replicate back to the on-prem infrastructure. So there's definitely some crossovers, but I will say, I'm trying more and more to kind of write about things that help people to understand how groups can be that conduit to get them from on-prem into a cloud first kind of
Mm.
organization. So yeah.
And were there one point you say or you realized identity was becoming the new primary security boundary?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I guess the idea it's funny. So the company I work for, we tagline, right? The idea of the tenant is the new server. And for me, I think the realization really hit me around the COVID era, right? 2020. If we look at what happened, I know for me, right? I came home and one day I was just working remotely every day. And it was, okay, we need to start leveraging Teams more. We need to start, okay, I need to put these files that I can't get access to that SMTP file share anymore on prem. I need to put them over in OneDrive. And what I noticed is that those identities that used to be protected behind a firewall, they were on premise. You set up a new site, you put your AD server on prem, you get a firewall in place, you're good to go, right? That was no longer relevant. It moved to this cloud-based authentication where the identities were accessible from anywhere, right? I could go work from Starbucks, I could work anywhere. And so as easy as it is for me to log into it, the idea is if you're not securing those effectively, anyone can log into them from anywhere. That is the point of cloud native APIs and the ability to get to this stuff from anywhere. And so that for me, I think was the realization that if we're not locking down these identities, then inevitably we're just allowing the attackers to get in. And the one statement I hate hearing from a customer is, we got security defaults." I'm like, "Okay, well, let me be honest with you, Microsoft isn't necessarily secure by default. They're secure. They want collaboration. They don't care. They do care. Let's not say they don't care. They care about security, but if it hinders collaboration, then they choose to go with collaboration first." So, yeah.
Yeah, I see often there it's the I think companies often think we pay for all these security tools, so
Yeah.
Microsoft handles this for us. That it's yeah, it's a little bit risky thinking, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. I mean, you wouldn't put a server in place and then rely on the Comcast modem from your internet service provider. You would get a firewall, right? You would be precise about the technology. You would be intentional about what you're doing. So,
Mm,
same concept applies in the cloud. You gotta be
yeah,
intentional about it.
and I also see there's these thinking the one-time setup idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's also a little bit critical. But when you look back over your career,
Mhm.
what are some major shifts that change the way organization approach security?
Major ways organizations I mean, I think for me, the concept of what we're talking about today is really one of the major shifts, right? I know when I started with BPOS and getting into the Microsoft realm, conditional access wasn't necessarily as great as it is today, right? There were a lot of gaps in how it operated and things you could test. The what if wasn't really there. It just wasn't what it is today. Um, as conditional access has expanded, to me, conditional access has almost become the new modern firewall per se, right? It makes real-time decisions on actual, authorization and can you access this thing, right? You've authenticated to the identity platform, but do you have the authorization to access these things? And if not, it's a real-time engine that applies. And a lot of people like to apply it like a firewall. My network guys used to be like, "Oh, so it's like a firewall rule." And I'm like, not necessarily. Firewall rules have a priority and they go one by one. This is it challenges every policy all at the same time and then makes a real-time decision on it, right? So there are differences, but I think very similar overlap. And I think that's one of the bigger things that has changed for me when it comes to securing the new tenant as
Mm,
it stands today.
mm. We are also often hear identity as a new parameter. What does that really, or what does it actually mean in practice?
What was the question again? That
Uh,
identity.
Yeah, we often heard these I think phrase, identity is a
Yeah.
new parameter. What does it actually mean in practice?
Identity is the new perimeter? Yeah. Oh, gotcha. Yeah, yeah. So as far as it being the new perimeter, right? I mean, it is the entry point into everything. So I specifically, I think I did a post on it called identity is the new perimeter, and then data governance is the new blast radius, right?
Mm,
So the idea is that it ties back into everything that Microsoft preaches from defense in depth to zero trust. If an identity can be compromised and
mm,
someone can get claims into the tenant, the new server, right? They can sit there, they can lie, they can wait. That identity can then be used laterally, right? So I did an article last week on guest identities because it's often so overlooked. And the idea is guests can act like a Trojan horse. They're it's an identity that exists that we oftentimes just overlook. But the ideas are simple. If you can compromise that guest identity, which you don't have full necessary control around, and then you can do things like if you have weak guest restrictions, you can do things like enumerate groups. You can look at all the members. You can then look through those members and find someone who may have, privileged roles within the organization. So it really is the perimeter. You have to protect that because if you don't, that then leads to everything else that can happen inside the server, which is your data governance, getting access to your SharePoint sites. I mean, anything that you can think of inside, right? A lot of the conversations you have around governance are so critical because the idea is once they get in the house, what do they actually have access to? If you've got a really good data governance policy and a really good ability to lock that down, good to go. It's gonna give the administrators time that they really need to be sure that, okay, hey, we had a breach, the identity's been compromised. Now let's act onto our playbook. Let's disable the account, revoke all sessions, you know, authentication methods required need to be higher level. We want phishing resistant, things like that. So, yep.
How does yeah, identity or identities hack look like? How do attacker work in this space?
Um, they're getting more and more sophisticated. I mean, if you take a look over the past, God, month, right? The two main ways that they've tackled identities. The biggest one, I think it was Storm 9042 or 9242. The
Mhm.
most recent one, they leveraged SSPR attack vectors.
Mm,
So one of the things a lot of companies don't think about is the idea of leveraging SSPR, something that is meant for good, right? Being used for malicious intent. And so what they were able to do is and there's also a very interesting update coming from Microsoft that I just posted about today on LinkedIn. Hopefully everyone goes and takes a look at that as how they're trying to lock that protocol down a little more. But the idea there was essentially just continuing to flood users with password reset requests and then gain access into the identity infrastructure through that. So, I mean, it's common all over. I mean, I look at probably one of the last breaches I tackled when I was with the MSP was specifically around this concept. It was a company that they were business standard because in the MSP space, we still have a lot of small, mid-sized businesses that they don't fully understand or see the value in business premium and the ideas that we talk about with conditional access. And it was a company that was on business standard and they suffered a business email compromise. And what happened was very simple. They sent an email to someone in the organization. That person clicked on it. They were phished, right? They put their credentials in. They gave this person access into the organization. And then from there, two things happened. They had 2
mhm.
things. They registered a malicious enterprise app to give them a foothold into the organization long term. They also then were like, "Well, they may detect it, and we may have to do MFA." So they registered their own SMS, authentication method, and that's why it's important that from an authentication method, we disable these things. But what they did is they put a phone number in, and they labeled it free food because they were that easy to get into. They had actually been compromised multiple times. Yeah. So, attackers have a sense of humor, it turns out.
Yeah. And I think, um, yeah, I think, cybersecurity, it's yeah, it's a topic, and
It
I
is.
think all we all speak about hacking the infrastructure, but why do I don't know if it's really shift. I think for trend well, no more than 20 years, we have called a university to and say, "I'm the professor,
Yep.
working for the professor to get free internet access."
Yep,
So,
yep.
so I think that's also can you give the password? I think it's not so new, but, um, why do attackers target identities before they, target the infrastructure?
I mean, I think they take in my opinion, I mean, attackers are targeting the most susceptible, easiest thing, right? So humans are very fallible. They they can be fished, right? They want to believe that people have good intentions at mine, and it's not to say that everyone doesn't, but there is bad in the world, right? There are people who want to take advantage of people in that way. And that's why things like phishing resistance, passkeys, all of
Mhm.
these things are so critical to me. I write about them a lot because we are faulted, right? Like we want to assume these things, but at the end of the day, I've clicked on a link before, not unintentionally, right? Like, oh yeah, that does sound extremely relevant to what I'm doing today, and that's the thing, and that's why it's so dangerous with the introduction of AI because if you think about we all joke about the attacks back in the day, right? The crown prince in Africa reaching out to me. It's like, "Oh, does he needs help from me? Like, what?" These attacks were almost laughable back in the day, but when you introduce something like AI to the mix,
Yeah.
which can easily scrape your entire organization and start to build out a flow chart and understand, "Oh, your CEO is over at this meeting today." You know, they can then incite a sense of urgency in you as a user because that's something we have, right? Our emotions go from 0 to 100 very quickly, and so what they do is they incite this urgency, like, "Hey, it's the CEO. I'm over at, this conference today." Of course, they're at that conference today. We know they're over at that conference today, right? It seems legitimate. I mean, without and the fact of the matter is when that urgency level hits, your brain, just that fight or flight mechanism in your brain doesn't necessarily sometimes go, "Hold on, stop. Why would they be reaching out to me directly?" Right? And because of that false sense of urgency, you just go, "Oh, I need to help this person. I need to do this," right? And I've literally watched financial teams get messages like that, and next thing I know, they're wiring $10,000 in a wire transfer because they think the CEO is actually at the conference, everything checked out. They didn't have the appropriate data governance in place, right? To put a 2 gate like, "Hey, anything over this amount of money, don't wire it unless you get approval from X and Y," instead of just giving them full autonomy to just send a wire transfer of 10K. Next thing you know, you're dealing with forensics teams trying to understand why $10,000 was just wired to someone over in, Zimbabwe. So, yeah, long-winded answer.
Yeah. I I think, we have before we jump in the cloud, we
Yeah,
have, Active Directory,
sure.
Active Directory. So did you think, uh, for companies, it's also important to look at their, identity strategy at AD, or can we handle all with Entra?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it really depends on the business model, right? And, like, what specifically so, I work for an organization where we had a lot of legacy applications and a lot of need for legacy AD. Case in point, I've got extreme experience with Azure. A part of what I did was I built AVD environments for organizations. When I started building out Azure environments, unlike this past year where we're now cloud native and everything can be done cloud native there was reliance on Active Directory. So I couldn't build an Azure Virtual Desktop environment without doing hybrid identities. Meaning, and while inter-domain services is a thing, there's still legacy workloads that rely on things like Kerberos, right? SMTP, like we NTFS file shares. There are legitimate needs within the organization. I do believe in this past year, Microsoft has really done an amazing job at pushing the boundary at what to really cause you to have to rethink, do I still need Active Directory? From the introduction to the new features within Entra Cloud Sync, one of the biggest limitations that it had was if you think about today, um, organizations that wanted to hybrid join, meaning they had all their devices, they didn't want to just immediately, join them into Entra only. That's a huge uplift. That's a huge project hour to get rid of that old legacy Active Directory join initiative. They've moved the needle on that, and that you can now join directly to Intune with Intra Cloud Sync. So you can do that hybrid join, which is a great intermediary step from on-prem to cloud only. So I do think there are still legacy needs. I think, understanding Active Directory and the OU structures and really understanding what that is and how to reshape and rethink that with the cloud. If you look at Entra ID, it's a flat landscape. There's no OU structure. There's not the same LDAP kind of category and everything you have there, right? These are all new protocols, new identity structures that exist today. And I think that's why I go back to the idea of why groups are so critical. A lot of what we try to do with OUs can be accomplished within the group structure and the group conventions that exist within Entra ID today. So, yeah, I think it's extremely critical. But yeah, I do think every organization moving forward from today needs to take a hard look at, okay, what do we still rely on Active Directory for? And the post that I released today, called "Groups: The Connective Tissue," right? The idea is start to look at how can I use this cloud first approach to start minimizing my reliance on Active Directory? Because the trap that we fall in, specifically in the MSP space, is that we're like, "Oh, it's just, it's easy. We gotta do this. We'll get rid of this sometime later on." And then it just sits there, and no one ever gets rid of it. So when you start looking at new SaaS apps that you wanna introduce, the first thing we tackled as an organization was file shares and printers. We moved those holistically to Azure. We started using Azure Premium Files. We started
Mm,
using, we tried Universal Print, but then we found a much better product called Printex that actually was amazing for cloud printing, and had a few less limitations, than what Universal Print had. But the idea was we started leveraging those and moving those needs off-prem from Active Directory into the cloud. And by doing that, we could then target it with groups. We could then connect those systems directly into Entra ID. That was then groups and GPOs and other aspects of the on-prem identity that we could start to diminish and get rid of within the organization. And then it just easily keeps shifting from there to a cloud-first world.
mm. And there it's, I think, conditional access. For listeners, they are new with the topic. What exactly is it?
What exactly is conditional access? Ah, perfect question. So I have a GitHub repository and I'm going to give you the answer from that. There's a real official, right? A kind of explanation on what it is. The John Hope explanation, it's the modern day cloud identity and workload firewall. In the modern cloud, identity is the new server. It's the control plane that every access request goes through. So again, I correlate it to the idea of a firewall a lot of times, but essentially it's a zero trust control plane that makes real time decisions on authorization and do you have access. So it's an authentication and authorization mechanism that says, okay, you've authenticated. Do you have the ability to contact this? Does your device that you're working for have the ability to access this? So, in a layman's term, that's my explanation of it.
Yeah. I read, I think it was on one of your blogs, did you say one, or, yeah, you consider conditional access one of the most powerful security controls in Microsoft 365. Uh, why did you think this?
Why? Because if you look at it, right, you actually talk about this a lot. Or let me be very clear. My favorite my favorite talk, if anyone hasn't gone and listened to it, is governance is an illusion. That podcast you did was amazing. And the idea is that if you look at conditional access, you made a point in there that there isn't necessarily a unified control plane for everything because inside of M365, there are aspects that have their own unique identities and connections, right? Exchange has the XO command module. Purview has the IPP session modules. You've got SharePoint with the SPO modules, right? They have their own capabilities. Conditional access is that thing that tries its best to unify security from across the board. If you think about conditional access, yes, it secures identities, and its main purpose is to make sure that the identities do have the access it needs. But on top of that, it hooks into all those other modules. So Intune, it can look at your device compliance statistics. It says, well, wait a second, is this device still healthy, right? What does Intune say it's still healthy? Okay, cool. Then we have a compliance policy inside of Intune that's telling us and giving those signals back for the conditional access policy to make a real-time decision at that moment. It hooks into Defender for cloud, right? It hooks into Defender, period, right? So we have app enforced restrictions. So if you build policies into Defender, it's able to then pass through, make a real-time decision. Are you connected to a third-party VPN that you shouldn't be? Okay, if you're connected to that, you don't get access into the organization, right? It's able to make all these decisions purview. You're able to do authentication context and then apply conditional access on top of it to protect that from accessing, critical SharePoint sites. There are ways that you can do this natively within each of these tools, but conditional access is kind of that, in my opinion, that last stop kind of gated process to ensure that at the end of the day, all of these aspects are protected.
Mm.
So
And when you get a new client, what's the first conditional access policy that you look if they have deployed it?
yeah. So so hopefully everyone after this goes to my GitHub repository and I'll make sure you have all the links. Hopefully you have all the links to that.
Mm,
So there are 6 policies in my repository that I consider foundation policies. So
mhm.
there's not necessarily one policy. Obviously, if there was one policy, it would just be MFA for all users, regardless of what you're doing, right? That is that is at a clear cut. That is what security defaults tries to do, but fails horribly at. Um, as far as like what I recommend to anybody, it is there are 6 fundamental policies, Not looking at your Intune, do you have Intune, right? Because at the end of the day, one of the requirements for conditional access is a P1 license. So assuming you have 10 users and 10 P1 license in your infrastructure, this is the bare bones what you could still do to protect that organization. Just because you have P1 doesn't mean you have an Intune Plan 1 license and can do compliant devices. And I break those down into those 6 policies, essentially starting with all MFA for all users, MFA for all admin roles. Typically there, I want to use a stronger authentication method. So I want to use something that is phishing resistant if they are an admin or have a privileged role. And then there's the 2 fundamental policies that I believe every tenant should have, which is blocking device code flow and blocking legacy auth. They are known attack vectors that, very sophisticated nation state, organizations have attacked and have been, instrumental in gaining access to the organizations time and time again. And then I do a 2-gated process for allowed countries. And I recommend those for every person because the idea is I if you do one block country policy, inevitably what happens is humans travel. And then what we do is we say, cool, I'm going to put them as an exclusion because they're traveling. And it's like, cool. Well, now that Bob's in the Bahamas, you just allowed him in from Russia and his account gets compromised in the Bahamas and he's now accessing everything from Russia. So there's a very deep dive on why I recommend the way doing the policies the way I do, but I highly believe in that concept of you have to be intentional on where people can access specifically on country codes, but understanding that countries aren't the end all be all, right? Those bad actors have access to a VPN into Azure here in the US, right? But it's kind of a fundamental thing of like, let's stop the low hanging fruit because it is a vector that people use. So those would be the 6 that I would say every company needs regardless of what they're doing.
Uh, awesome. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's so funny. What all happened? But the role of AI. When I look in Entra,
Yeah.
for me, I say the co-pilots or the AI stuff
Yeah.
looks more than a human than an application. Did
Yeah.
did you think? Yeah, this is. Yeah, I don't know. Um, AI is a new vector for attacks.
Oh,
Uh,
100%. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, 100%. There was actually I wrote about this one, and I'm trying to think what the session was. There was an amazing session at Ignite this past year. I attended it. It was essentially the foundation of identity, and it was 2 of the principal architects from Microsoft talking about how they fundamentally targeted identity inside the organization, right? One of the facts that I got from it to actually 2 very interesting facts I got from it. One was that they were, their entire organization's kind of all in on Passkeys, right? So they're using Passkeys, they're eating their own dog food, drinking their own champagne internally. I think that's amazing. The other thing was the fact that it was shown on one of the screens that according to their, data, and I believe they mimic this in the digital defense playbook, is that there only 80% of administrative level accounts are protected with MFA. Meaning there is a 20% of
also,
organization. And if you look at the landscape of what Microsoft sees, that's a lot of companies out there. 20% is a lot of privileged roles that they're seeing without MFA on it. So if you're one of those companies, please go get MFA enabled for those accounts. But what the point of that conversation, the point of that whole session is the idea of we have to empower AI for good, right? AI can be used for negative things. It can be used to figure out how to, compromise an identity, move laterally within an organization. But the idea is that we need to leverage AI for good. And I believe what they're trying to do with Security Copilot. I tested this. Be careful. With that tool. But yeah, the idea is it's good, right? Humans make mistakes all the time. We click a button, we think we have it exactly the same way, and then we go and try to do it 10 more times, and each one looks a little different. And that's the idea of using AI and automation is to create a standard configuration and then be able to do that very contiguously across each environment, right? For my space, the MSP space where I came from, right? We're managing 120 different clients. So you take 10 to 12 conditional access policies across
Mhm.
120 tenants. There is an exponential amount of errors that can be created if you're manually doing that. So that's the idea of how AI comes in and really helps to make it more efficient, but also catch those hidden mistakes that we sometimes overlook as humans. So,
Mm.
yeah.
What I often see is that organizations separate Azure security from identity security.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, there are, I say, interconnected. They're really interconnected. But
Yeah.
why did companies have these uh, kind of thinking? What's your perspective on this?
So it's different across organizations. I think the mindset of what you're getting to there fundamentally is an enterprise mindset of, separation of roles, kind of separation of duties that exist within an organization. So I think the idea of like you have your infrastructure team, right? That's the Azure side. Their primary responsibility is looking at Azure infrastructure, NSGs, the VNets, making sure all these rules are optimized and working effectively. But that is and I will die on this hill that there is a massive need for these teams to come together to talk and be more efficient. The new introduction of this cloud connected world, these silos can't continue to exist. And there's been some really good conversations. I know Meryl Fernando on Entra had a great conversation about this, because he's had a lot of time and work on the zero trust assessment. And the idea is like these teams have to come together because it can't continue to be siloed. And there's a huge overlap, and there's a reason why I specifically talk about the fundamental role that Azure plays in identity, um, as far as how those 2 coexist. And, I mean, any identity admin who's ever tried to go figure out what's going on in a whether it's conditional access or just looking through logs, should understand the hardship of doing that manually, right? And so the idea is if you have Azure infrastructure, you can set up log analytics workspace. You can set up Sentinel around those workspaces, right? There's huge opportunities there. I specifically coming from the Azure side, built tons of KQL queries and tons of quick ways to check for specific logs. And that completely changed the way on how I did conditional access rollouts. So, and a lot of people don't know that. They don't know about these built-in KQL workbooks that exist in Azure that help you deploy out conditional access for identity.
Yeah, I think zero trust plays.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's so important topic. A lot of people handle it a little bit like, yeah, I don't know, like the tinfoil head guys. But yeah, what roles plays zero trust for you in an Azure architecture?
What roles play a zero trust in an Azure architecture for me? Um, I want to make sure I break down that question correctly, right? I mean, inevitably the idea there is just ensuring that you don't have master owner roles. So like when I was deploying out Azure infrastructure, I used Bicep. I was very explicit on who had the owner role. And the idea there is no one gets an owner role, right? Like other than, me as to your point, you have to have someone that owns it, right? Who is the responsible party for the organization? Outside of that, the network, we need to start to minimize what they have. And the whole idea of zero trust is cool. If you're just working on the network side of things, then this is what you need access to. These are the redeemable roles that you can leverage to then do that. But I don't want you messing with the Azure files over here, right? There's always an interconnection between the teams and the roles that are needed. But the idea is kind of controlling that blast radius, right? Like if you compromise the identity, but you don't have access to the SharePoint data that you want, you've contained it, right? You've given your team time back to get in and do the things necessary to remediate the issue and then fix it before any damage is done, before those files are maybe, corrupted or deleted maliciously, before data's exfiltrated and you got to go to a governing organization and tell them that there was a data breach in your organization. That's the whole idea. And the same thing exists within Azure. We've got to make sure that we're controlling who has access and then building automation to alert. Like I did extensive automation around break glass accounts. If a break glass account was used, if someone sneezed and they were even thinking of logging in with the break glass account, I wanted to get notified on it. Like I knew every time a break glass account was logged in, I had multiple alerts coming from anything. And depending on, I had an alert that was like, if the break glass account is used outside of a country, like outside of my, respected country, let me know. And it immediately high critical alert started flashing bells. I didn't have a siren in the office, but if I did, I would have figured an automation flow to like sound the alarm on the siren. Like it was, it was obvious what was going on.
Yeah, awesome. You said Bicep, so Bicep. So, yeah, then we have to talk about infrastructure as code. So,
Oh, yes.
uh,
Let me tell you
how
that
do
story.
how does for your perspective,
Yeah.
IAC or in infrastructure as code improve security outcomes?
Oh my god. It's everything. So, let me give you a little bit of backstory on why I got to that
Mhm.
point. So, I was given a mandate by my previous organization that I worked at. I needed to move every client that we had hosted in a data center into Azure. I was very new into Azure architecture. I was, an AVD specialist. I had already gotten the cert for that. I was in my Azure admin days working on the 104. And what I was doing is I was building out the first client into Azure. So I am a stickler for if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. Like if you can't document exactly what you're doing, then the standardization doesn't exist, right? I have to be able to document every step of what I'm doing so that I can come back and repeat said steps. So if you look, I have a legacy document I built that I haven't made public, but I have this document. It's about 120 some pages. And it's every step that I took in the portal to deploy out the Azure infrastructure from how the NSG got created to how the Azure file shares were created to each individual settings. I had screenshots of all the settings. I had the private endpoint connection to the Azure file share so they could connect correctly from on-prem. I then went back to the beginning of the document and I tried to do it for the next client. Everything changed. The speed and the rate at which Microsoft is changing the interface is so fast that there is no amount of documentation that can keep up with it. And it was in that moment when I had to start that second project that I said, this is unattainable. I will not be able to maintain this document and this stay relevant long term. And so when that realization happened, I did two things. I started looking at Terraform and I started looking at
Mhm.
Bicep. I
Uh-huh.
looked at Terraform. I like Terraform. I didn't love all the requirements around Terraform and some of the files that you had to leverage. And I really took a hard look at, okay, what's my objective here? And my objective was not necessarily to interconnect with other clouds and not to necessarily maintain anything on premise. So I said, I feel like I'm kind of making it harder by looking at Terraform. Not that I've talked to a ton of Terraform developers. It's an amazing product. Highly recommend it. But then I started looking at Bicep and I go, okay, well, what the heck is this Bicep thing? Right? It's a native DSL. So it's a domain specific language that integrates into Azure. The underlying protocol of ARM, Azure Resource Manager, is JSON. And the idea is JSON is extremely complex to look at. It's extremely complex to modify. But then you look at something like Bicep, extremely intuitive, very friendly. Hey, create a resource storage account. I want it to have these properties. So I started digging in. I watched all kinds of videos. I started learning from other developers, and I was able to build a zero trust ish architecture, right? Within Azure, I was able to create custom Azure policies, right? A lot of people overlook that, but Azure has amazing guardrails built in through the Azure policy mechanism. I was able to build all of that out with Bicep. And I went through it one time and I deployed an entire infrastructure. What would have taken me 3 days was dropped down to about a 4 to 6 hour time period. And I was like, "Oh, this is it. This is the whole point of what Azure's trying to do, right?" They really don't want you necessarily in the interface. They have to provide a UI and an interface, but at the end of the day, those APIs stay the same. A lot of them are very similar. Now they may add functionality into it, and that's why you gotta get up to date on what new APIs are available, what within the Bicep code you can actually modify. But I have an entire infrastructure built out by in Bicep as infrastructure as code. I can go deploy that today and it still works the same way. So that is the idea. You take a standard configuration and you're able to replicate it effectively across every tenant. I did this for tenant after tenant as I moved them. I just took it. I had an entire AVD build out. So everything was built out in Bicep code. Everything custom script. It would call a custom script. It would join it to a domain because you're probably doing hybrid at the time. All of that stuff was just built in, and it was the same across every deployment I did. The naming conventions, the regions, the policies as far as locking it down, right? Like that's one of those vectors you have to look at. If you leave Azure open up to the world, people are going to come in, they're going to start crypto mining on your dime. They're going to build some in-series VMs and just say, "Cool, let me have at it." The idea is you don't if you're not deploying in-series VMs that need this, intense GPU functionality, don't deploy them. Put a gate in, put an Azure policy in place that eliminates their ability to even do that, right? So yeah, that kind of is a long-winded, but it's my story there.
So we can say a bicep is is the same what
Exactly.
PowerShell is for managing automating
Yeah.
tasks, and bicep is then for deploying Azure resources.
Yeah, but it's a desired state configuration protocol, right? Meaning that it's so two things that Bicep has is desired state and item potent. So it can be rerun again and again and do the exact same task. Whereas PowerShell, right? PowerShell is like you have to tell it where to go. And if it hits an issue, it kind of just stops. It's like telling someone how to get from point A to point B. There may be three different ways you can get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
Bicep's just like, I don't care the direction you take. I just want the end state, the desired state to look like this. And that's what Bicep does really effectively is it provides what the end state should look like and it can be continuously run and evaluated. Does the end state still match this? If someone makes a change, nope, revert it right back. The end state
Oh,
should look like this. And that's the idea. That's how it standardizes that configuration, which inevitably, if you standardize your configuration, security is going to improve from that methodology.
and how do what those role does here biceps be, or how good is biceps when we talk about version control?
Bicep, when we talk about version control, as far as version control, I would say that a lot of the Bicep is gonna depend on you. So, like, as far as version control, I mean, a lot of what we handled was within our DevOps, repo environment. Markdown was a great way to keep track of notes. I will say, version control, you can go in and because it's using Git as the underlying engine, right? Like, if you're probably using Git for that, I would hope it's stored in something like GitHub or within Azure DevOps. You can constantly see any of the versions that were created previously and the modifications that were made inside the actual code that you're leveraging. But just like I said, if you can't document it, I still believe there's a case for extreme documentation. You should be very aware of any context that is needed outside of it. Not everyone is using Bicep with the CI/CD pipeline, right? Like, hopefully, some of it you are automating with the CI/CD pipeline, but at the end of the day, Bicep can be used very manually. You can build a Bicep file and manually deploy it, and it still does ABC just like you want. So the idea is using something like Markdown to help document any context that's needed around the Bicep. At the end of the day, all the version is maintained within the Git repos that you're hopefully storing your Bicep files in.
Mm. And how do you convince traditional infrastructure teams to adapt infrastructure as a code?
That's a great question, right? I feel like the answer is always it depends in technology, right? Like legacy infrastructure teams, you got the guys that just want to sit in front of the server and do the manual steps, right? So that's going to be a
Yeah.
harder sell. But then you got the guys that are like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to save time, right? So they're building PowerShell scripts. So I think for those PowerShell, gurus, it's an easy sell, right? What if I told you there was PowerShell, but even more verbose and you didn't have to be as explicit? I think it's an easy sell, right? Like, let's start seeing how we can use that same automation capabilities to maintain that adherence to the security configuration. Now, as far as the people that aren't necessarily looking at infrastructure as code, I would say that it is time to start looking at that, right? That's going to be a harder sell because there are people who just get scared by the fact of automation and things of that nature. But I think when you look at what AI is doing in the industry and where the industry is going, it's going to become more and more pertinent that every organization is looking at infrastructure as code. You know, that is what AI is doing at the end of the day, right? And like use the tools. If you look at some of the new Microsoft models, they have MAI 1.1 code, right? Like it's a coding model. It's we're trying to demystify how hard coding is and break it down into, hey, what is it that you want to do? Tell me what you're trying to do. I'll build you the script to do that, right? And so that is the idea. I think that's really where the conversation is going to lead to is like it's not something to be afraid of. It's something that we have to embrace to become more efficient as an organization.
There is also, I think, not a really new topic, but yeah, uh, a lot of people now talking about policy as code. Can you a little bit explain what is it and how it's fit into a broader governance picture?
I can definitely take a stab at it. I mean, so if I look at policy as code, right? Like, I mean, I have a ton of things that exist within that policy as code realm. The organization I work for, Enforcer, right? That we are kind of policy as code. We are a wrapper on top of the Graph API. So the idea is, if you look at identity specifically, right? Conditional access is code. It's there's Graph APIs. There's things that wrap around it to be able to then bring that into a consistent manner. And that's one of the things we try to do. If you look at Azure as code, right? I talked about Azure policy. It's one thing that gets overlooked completely, but it shouldn't, right? From a governance and a compliance standpoint, one of the policies that I built out is I worked with a lot of medical companies. So we had to look at if you look at Azure, there's a 476 HIPAA, high aligned policy for governance of HIPAA organizations. So now I'm gonna be honest, I looked through all 470 of those. There's a lot. There's some that are processes and procedures. When it comes to the medical space, a lot of it relies on processes and procedures and how you're doing things as the human identity inside the organization. There are technical things though. There's auditing capabilities. You have to be able to go back at any point in time and pull the logs and look at, okay, did they have access from this, right? Did your NSGs or did your VNets have login enabled on them? Did your storage accounts have login enabled on them? All of that is critical. And that kind of ties into the full concept and the full picture of why Bicep as code, why policy as code is such an important concept. Because in order to enforce those policies, you have to have those configurations set. So the policy has to ensure that there's a technical prerequisite that's being met. Okay, cool. Our policy is to ensure that we have logging for 8 months. Cool.
Yep.
There's a technical configuration that has to be in place to ensure that logging is being held. And then you need a fail-safe loop that goes back and says, cool, do we have those configurations in place? And is the policy correct? Awesome. And at the end of the day, who's the human that's accountable for all of that, right? And that's who the owner of said governance needs to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies have this, I don't know, misconception. We are, yeah, we are compliant, we have policies, so we are secure. um, yeah, but we also have to do, I think, another podcast, and we talk about HIPAA and healthcare. I think it's also an
Oh,
interesting
yeah.
topic. I came from medtech. I have worked years in medtech, so this is a really
Oh,
interesting.
really?
Yeah,
Really? Okay.
yeah, famous health genius. I don't know, you know them. Um, yeah, but yeah, let's look a little bit in the future.
Okay.
A little bit more, and there is, yeah, you're an MVP, so I think you was in Redmond on the MVP summit.
So I just got my MVP status very recently. I missed the summit this year. My buddy, Lewis Berry, is also an MVP. He did go. So I heard about all the good times had, and I've talked to a lot of the identity architects that were there. So I'm really excited for the next one. But yeah, no, very new. I've been doing a lot in the space for a while, but very new to the MVP side of things. So I'm
Yeah.
really excited to be here.
Then first, congratulations
Thank you.
to your
Yeah.
MVP award. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, that's really cool. But then it's cool. So you can talk a little bit about what did you see in the future in the Microsoft security roadmap, and what excites you there most?
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. The thing that excites me the most with Microsoft security these days, is just how they are advancing conditional access and the idea of passkeys as a whole. I think Microsoft is doing a lot. I mean, if you look at the recent announcements over the past few months, right? The SSPR, instance that we talked about, they're doing a lot around locking these things down. They're doing a lot around agents in general, as far as bringing those agents and creating this frontier model where agents are able to connect into every aspect of what you're doing across the Microsoft stack and provide real-time value back. So I look at what they're doing with the security copilot agent, and then conditional access as a whole, right? Like there are issues. Every conditional access deployment is not pristine the way it exists, right? And so being able to use AI to evaluate it, and then being able to use the AI to then provide responses back where someone can communicate easily, right, through a chat agent and go, okay, well, wait a second, why is that policy not working correctly? And then be able to dig into the Microsoft side, right? If we look at some of the changes, app enforced restrictions have changed. If you look at recent updates, there used to be I did when I did conditional access, I would go check Fabian Batter's Entra scopes every time. And because there were some low level scopes that got removed by default if you excluded any service principal. Well, Microsoft has made changes in that area. So now those four same low level scopes that would get excluded by default are no longer. That was an update as of March this past year. Microsoft is continuing to push the limits on what they are doing when it comes to identity security. Two of the things that I guess excite me the most are how much they are pushing the idea of passkeys and FIDO2 phishing resistant authentication. If you look at over the past few months, right, the introduction of synced passkeys is an amazing way to start bridging the gap between technical requirements and usability from a human perspective, right? The idea of if I can go to someone, it doesn't make sense. If I show them how a passkey works, they're going to fall asleep, right? If I go, yeah, well, you just take your phone, you scan this QR code. There's AL3, encryption, authentication, PK. Let me tell you how public and private keys work, right? They don't care how PKI works. What they care about is they like their iPhone. They like to scan their face and get in. So if I can explain to them, we can replicate that exact same behavior, whether it's a Mac or a Windows device. We've got Windows Hello for Business, which is going to use that same phishing resistant authentication. Macs with the platform SSO using the secure enclave, Touch ID. So you just click it and you're in your device, right? If they can get that same type of iPhone like experience with all of their enterprise tools, it's a huge addition to being able to start to bring the average user into the ecosystem where phishing resistance becomes a tangible thing for a lot of people that otherwise wouldn't have adopted it. I think that's a huge point that I'm excited to see how it continues to advance. The new registration campaigns are pushing that and incentivizing that behavior, which I think is amazing for Microsoft's end. The other aspect is, while I have not gotten to play with it, as much as I would have liked, is, it kind of a play on with the verified ID and then the account recovery process, right? That was
Oh,
a really cool, uh, implication or a new technology that they added so that, when you do get that new phone, you're not necessarily bound. Maybe you don't have sync passkeys, but you have account recovery. So now if you get that new phone, you lose your phone, whatever the case may be, you can go in, and if your organization has this set up, you can use kind of another identity provider to go, okay, nope, yep, I see your government issued ID. That is you. Okay, cool. I'm going to generate a tap for you. You're going to use that tap to then bootstrap the process into getting your new phishing resistant credential set up. You never had to contact the help desk. You never had to get any of that done. That one's super exciting. The problem is I don't have a third party provider right now set up in my tenant because I'm broke, and everybody, money's a real thing. So I do need to get that going so I can do some testing there. But yeah.
yeah. A while, I think for 3 weeks, I have started the synthetic market, and it's rounds, and it's I think 1,300 companies between 1 and 1,000
Okay.
users, and
Yeah.
it's run from the I call it what was the name? The gold standard, all Azure information, and
Yeah.
it's now it's plays different characters or different employees, and then it learns where security issues come from. That was a really, really fun project.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
I got some 150,000 Azure credits for free, so I can try it
Oh,
out.
man. That's yeah, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
this was really fun. Um, yeah, but that's really interesting, and I think there comes a lot of new stuff, and yeah. Um, yeah, let's jump in the quick fire round. Uh,
Okay.
I say some things, and you say what's come first on your mind. So,
Okay.
pa- passwords or passkeys,
Passkeys.
Azure policy or conditional access,
Oh, conditional access all day.
security or productivity,
Security. I
most underrated Microsoft security feature.
most underrated, Microsoft security feature? Defender. Defender as a whole.
And when you get one day at Microsoft CEO position, and you can say one thing Microsoft should develop uh, tomorrow, what should it be?
A true multi-tenant interface. They they need one. It's hard. It's all very separate still, and it's obvious.
And coffee, tea, or energy through red teaming?
Coffee. I literally have my Starbucks in hand right now.
And is number one your biggest security myth?
Biggest security myth. Uh,
Mm,
security defaults are secure by default. It's a crazy myth that exists. They are not.
Yeah. Okay. Then my closing question is: if every listener should cold implement just one change this week that would dramatically improve their security posture, what should it be and why?
Mm, interesting. I would say, that would be authentication methods. I think they should look at their existing authentication methods, and if they have email, TOTP, or SMS, they need to look at getting those cut off. I think using the higher privilege, the more secure. I've got an article on authentication methods on conditionalaccess.tech. I hope everyone will look at that article and kind of guide some context to why I'm saying that. But I think that's a critical component that's often overlooked.
Yeah. So, Jonathan, thank you for joining us today and sharing your experience on identity, security, conditional access, Azure governance, and infrastructure as a code. Um, yeah, and I will say, remember, in the cloud first world, secure identities isn't just a part of security. It's security. I think that's my learning for today. And yeah, thank you for listening to the M365 podcast. And thank you, John, for being here. And I hope we have another session and we talk about hyper and healthcare.
Yeah, yeah, no, I would love that. Awesome. Thanks, Marco, for having me. I appreciate it, man.